The time is now for the Dr. Bob Sports Podcast. I am Tanner. I am our head of analytics. And for the past 6 years, I've been working alongside Bob, originating our NFL and college basketball bets. And today I am joined, as always, by our digital media specialist, Grant. How we doing?
Doing great, Tan. Super excited for this episode. I'm kind of a fantasy football junkie myself, so this should be a fun one for me.
Yeah, it should be fun. I don't really dive into fantasy nearly as much as I'm looking at the betting markets, but there's certainly plenty to say today about the quarterbacks and running backs.
Yeah, there is. And once again, Tan, we see you've got a different backdrop. Where are you at? What have you been up to?
Yeah, it's been a crazy. I mean, since we last recorded, when we did our NFC East podcast, I was at Lake Winnipesaukee, and since then, I spent a week in Tokyo, and now I'm in San Francisco. So just on the move, getting the last few trips in before I stay in the bunker for the next 7 months during the NFL and college basketball seasons.
So today we are doing our quarterbacks and running backs fantasy football edition. And thank you for everyone that's left your comments and questions. Don't forget to leave some more comments, questions about the wide receivers and tight ends, and we will address them on Friday's episode. All right, let's jump right into quarterbacks. So we're going to be using our ADP from ESPN, and when we look at quarterback, we see that we have a clear big three. It goes Mahomes, Allen, Hurts, and which is also how they all finished in scoring last year. So Mahomes and Allen have both finished as the QB1 two times, but Jalen has not. Do you have all of these guys in the same tier?
I certainly have all of them in the top tier, but I think you can poke holes in all of their cases for the 2023 season. I'm worried about that offensive coordinator change in Philadelphia. I think it's going to be a clear downgrade, losing Shane Steichen. Josh Allen has averaged 7.6 rushing touchdowns per season throughout his career, and I'm just concerned we're going to see that drop off because the Bills offseason this year signaled they wanted to, run the ball out of more heavy personnel packages, drafting a tight end in the first round, signing Damian Harris. And then we talked in our very first podcast about the risk with this Chiefs offense if Travis Kelce falls off from being a top 5 receiver in the sport. And if he just, becomes an above average tight end in his age 34 season, I don't think that Patrick Mahomes is going to be able to match his ADP either.
Yeah, it's kind of weird seeing all three of these quarterbacks just push so high in ADP. It's like you don't usually have that with three quarterbacks being drafted this high.
Yeah, well, I think people have started to count on elite quarterbacks a little bit more just because they've been more consistent at delivering on their ADP year over year. And so they've started to move up draft board significantly, especially because, positions like running back have gotten less consistent. So people just want to bank on a certain amount of points coming from their quarterback position. And we know guys, like these three that we're talking about are going to score, but I just laid it out why these guys actually this year might be being a little bit overdrafted.
If you're waiting after these three, you have three proven guys that they're proven elite, real quarterbacks, and they're right on that cusp in fantasy. So we're going to talk about Burrow, Lamar, and Herbert. I mean, Burrow finishes the QB4 last year, and it feels like he's the safest pick here, but does this injury worry you for this fantasy season?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really worried about Burrow's injury. I mean, just from monitoring calf strains throughout the years, they usually only take a few weeks. And so holding him out any longer than that is probably just precautionary for the Bengals. That said, the market moved the Bengals as from they were 2.5 point favorites against the Browns in week 1, and now they're only favored by 1.5. So they are pricing in a little bit of risk here in the market that he misses week 1, although that would really surprise me.
Yeah, and we just got news earlier in the week that Joe Burrow was seen sprinting at practice. So this was on August 12th, which I think is a pretty good sign that it looks like he's going to be healthy. But how much more room for improvement does Burrow have for a better fantasy finish than QB4?
Well, I'm not really sure we can expect Burrow to get any better than he was last year, just due to the defenses in his division. I mean, we talked about in that AFC North podcast how the Ravens, Browns, and Steelers are all potentially top 10 defenses, and that's 6 games on his schedule. Now, That said, the Bengals defense themselves will likely be getting worse after losing both starting safeties. So there's potential for the Cincinnati to get into more shootouts outside of the division, just because their own defense is going to be worse, and the Bengals offense will have to match that.
Yeah, I think their shootouts are pretty likely this year, but let's move on to his division rival, Mr. Lamar Jackson. So Lamar finished sixth in in points per game, but finished as the QB 14 with 12 games played in 2022. He's been shut down for injuries in back-to-back seasons, but now he has a new OC, upgraded pass catchers, and most importantly, he's got health back. So do the injuries in the past scare you away from Lamar?
Well, in general, I think factoring injuries into your draft strategy is a fool's errand, and it's typically overpriced in the fantasy market. I mean, how many people last year were adamant that Christian McCaffrey shouldn't be taken as the first running back because he was definitely going to get hurt? Still, I'll acknowledge that Lamar, just due to his play style, is likely to get more injured than just your average quarterback. But I think it isn't as likely as this ADP implies, and that's just due to recency bias with him missing the fantasy playoffs these past couple of seasons. People are just kind of out on Lamar, even the supporters that have drafted him these past few years. So I don't know. I'm not super worried about the injury concern, but I acknowledge that it could happen for a third straight year.
Yeah, Lamar's rushing upside and upgraded weapons feels like he's got a pretty good shot to kind of rise back into that elite tier. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, we love the hiring of offensive coordinator Todd Monken, and I think he has as good a shot as any of the guys we talked about. The big three. I think Lamar could be right in there with those guys as in the conversation to finish as the QB1 this year. I mean, Monken is going to take deep shots. We know that from his time in Tampa Bay when he was the play caller. He had a 28% deep pass rate, which was 40% above the league median, and he also is very good at drawing up effective screenplays, which has been Lamar's kryptonite. He hasn't been able to take on those blitzes throughout his career. And if he's just able to get, great screen dump off options when a defense brings a cover zero look, and they can punish teams for doing that. I really think that this could be one of Lamar's best seasons since 2019.
Yeah, it feels like he's being drafted almost at his floor if he stays healthy. But this feels like it's his floor. And I mean, if I had to staple a my guy for me this year, I think it's him.
Yeah.
But let's move on to Justin Herbert. So Herbert finished as the QB 11 last year, and a lot of managers feel burned by him because of his finish. But most of this was due to him playing through those rough injuries throughout the season. Do you think Herbert could be a steal at his ADP considering they added more weapons and got a new OC?
Well, on the weapons front, I'm not super enthused by just adding a rookie wide receiver. Usually those guys aren't going to make a massive difference, but especially the guys that were drafted near the end of the first round. But Kellen Moore at offensive coordinator is something I'm a lot more excited about, and certainly not playing with a ribs injury the entire season will help Herbert make a leap as well. And the last time Herbert was with a top 10 offensive coordinator, he finished as the QB 10 as a rookie with Shane Steichen calling the plays for him in 2020. He only played 15 games that year, and he wasn't even the starting quarterback in training camp. So I would see that as that's probably the lowest end outcome for a healthy Herbert this year. And there's certainly plenty of upside above that.
I mean, yeah, where is his upside and where's his floor with this team?
Yeah, well, that would be. I would say he's certainly going to be a top 10 quarterback. That's where I would put the floor,
Mhm.
because that's what he was his rookie year with a good play caller. And I mean, we feel like something happens every year with this Chargers offense, but if everything clicks, this could easily be a top 3 unit in the NFL. I mean, we've seen Kellen Moore's offenses finish top 3 in scoring when Dak has been the starter each of the last 2 seasons. I don't think it's crazy to say that Dak and Herbert are, on par with each other in talent, along with these supporting cats being pretty close together. So I don't know. I feel like Herbert could be in that top 3 mix this year if everything falls into place.
I also could see him returning to that top three. But this is a fun comparison. I think Everyone kind of likes to put these two head to head, and this is Justin Fields and Trevor Lawrence. So when we're looking at Justin Fields, in his second season, he absolutely popped in fantasy football. We just talked about one of the best rushing QBs in the game, and Justin Fields was an absolute steal in your draft last year. But now you got to pay the price for a guy who only
Mhm.
threw 17 TDs and was one of the least accurate passers in the league. Do you think he's going to be able to improve his passing this year now that he has DJ Moore?
Well, I'm open to the idea that Fields makes a big leap in his passing just because we haven't seen him with a competent receiving core or competent offensive line his whole career. But I honestly think it's more likely that he's just not a good passer based on what we've seen. I mean, we have a pretty large sample size right now, and we saw guys like Justin Herbert when he was a rookie, not play behind a pretty poor offensive line, and he was still able to get the job done in a much better way from a passing standpoint than Fields has ever been able to do. That said, Fields really doesn't have to be a good passer to be a great fantasy pick. I mean,
Mhm.
he finished as the QB6 last season as a terrible passer. So, I mean, the rushing floor here really bolsters Fields.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like he's going to be able to maintain that I mean, he's still going to have a good rushing year, don't get me wrong, but I don't think that's sustainable of what he just did last year, but if he takes that little
Yeah, I
bit
mean,
jump up in passing, he'll be okay.
well, I mean, to your point, the he had a ton of massive runs last year. I mean, he averaged 7.1 yards per carry, which just feels really hard to match. I doubt he does that again. So even if he is the best quarterback in the last decade in terms of rushing EPA in his first two seasons, it feels relatively unsustainable that he's just going to be able to go for seven yards a pop in
Yeah.
2023. So he's going to have to improve as a passer if he wants to even maintain his place, in the top 10 fantasy quarterbacks.
Yeah, I mean, he did go 3 for 3 week 1 with like 2 touchdowns. But all right, let's move on to Trevor Lawrence. So, in Trevor's first year with a real head coach, he was able to put up a top 8 fantasy finish. And as we mentioned in previous episodes, he made a gigantic strides from year 1 to year 2. And so Trevor looks like the last QB that could kind of be in this elite category. Do you think he's being drafted too late or just about right?
Well, I'm a little bit worried about Jacksonville's offense. We talked about that in the AFC South podcast. I mean, them losing both starting tackles to start the season is not is not a recipe for success. I feel like people are just glossing over the fact that Walker Little surrendered a 10% pressure rate last year, and Anton Robinson is a late first round rookie tackle. We typically see those guys struggle out of the gates, and one of those guys is going to have to play even when Cam Robinson comes off of his suspension.
Yeah, I mean, they made the big addition of Ridley. Do you think he's going to be able to put up more fantasy numbers now that he has a presumable like alpha receiver?
Yeah, I mean, Ridley, in my eyes, is a top 10 wide receiver. And, you know, Trevor Lawrence might be able to get more rushing yards because of all, just bailing out of all these bad pockets he's likely to get due to the poor tackle play. So, he's averaged less than 20 rushing yards per game to start his career. And we could actually see that number tick up with a poor offensive line, which we know is valuable in fantasy. So there is some things to like about Lawrence's case. From a fantasy standpoint as a quarterback, maybe more so than even just the Jaguars offense overall.
Yeah, if you look at Trevor's college film, I mean, one of his best traits was him taking off with his feet. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him finally kind of up those rushing numbers this year. But
Yeah.
if you're looking for a value outside the top 8 picks, kind of a QB2 for your team, is there anyone that you're kind of going to target here?
Yeah, for me, that guy is Geno Smith. I mean, he's a quarterback in that 10 to 20 range. He finished as QB5 last season, and it's hard to imagine Seattle's offense getting worse this year. I mean, both starting tackles go from being solid as rookies, and they'll likely be above average this year, making that leap in year 2. They drafted Jackson Smith and Jigba, which should help offensive coordinator Shane Waldron get into more 11 personnel formations that he's comfortable with from his time with Sean McVay in the Rams when he was the passing game coordinator there. And I mean, Geno also gets 4 games against the Rams and Cardinals, who are, maybe the two worst defenses in the NFL. So from a scheduling standpoint, that's amazing. Those are all smash spots. And I think that there is a decent chance that Geno finishes as a top 10 fantasy quarterback again. And I'm kind of surprised he's getting drafted this low.
Yeah, it's insane to see after what he did last year. I mean, I picked him up off a waiver wire in Dynasty football, and he's a QB2. But after doing it 1 year, and then the next year, you're still on ESPN. I got him right here. He's uh, drafted as the 15th quarterback. That's
Yeah,
just going to
yeah, that's
be
crazy.
that's an absolute steal. But let's move on to our running backs. And we've had a lot of questions about why we don't talk about running backs very much during the team previews. But do you want to explain kind of how you feel about running backs in real life football?
Yeah, we haven't got to talk much about running backs at all because they don't really matter when trying to handicap teams. Now, there's a few guys in the league that I'm factoring in when I'm doing my preseason priors, but for the most part, I'm just ignoring running backs when I'm doing my handicapping. Rushing offense plays an important role in our NFL model, but I think people overestimate how much running backs have an effect on rushing offense. In fact, it's pretty clear that scheme and blocking accounts for more rushing yardage than just running back skill. So when a running back goes out, it usually doesn't make a major difference in the team's offensive success because whatever the skill difference is between the top guy and the backup is offset by teams just passing more, which we know is a more efficient way to move the ball. For example, Mike Zimmer's Vikings always were a run first team with the bell cow Dalvin Cook. But a defensive coach in Zimmer was able to justify passing more when Cook went out. So the Vikings offense averaged 26.5 points per game when backup Alexander Madison started in the 2020 and 2021 seasons. That was a 6-game sample. And so, they lose their bell cow, but the offense actually starts scoring more points. And now the more analytically focused GM in Minnesota, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, were recognized that the offense isn't getting worse without Cook and has just decided to roll with Madison as the guy for the 2023 season.
Yeah, I don't blame these GMs for not paying. I mean, Google the last 10 running backs that have won a Super Bowl. I mean,
Yeah.
that'll show you right there. You don't need to pay $16 million to get your guy. But do you have any tips on finding running backs that are good for fantasy, even though their real life value might not be that great?
Well, I would say it comes down to more projected opportunity as it than any other position as it relates to skill. So quarterbacks we're just looking for skill guys. Wide receivers we
Mhm.
want guys that are actually talented. But running backs you don't need them to be talented to be effective fantasy scorers. I mean, for example, we just talked about Alexander Madison, who I don't even think is a top 30 back in terms of skill in the NFL, but he might be underdrafted right now because he's the feature back on a borderline top 10 offense, and he should be on the field for most third downs and will also likely be the goal line back in Minnesota.
Mhm. And so let's talk about the big three running backs here. You got CMC, Eckler, and Bijan at the top of your draft. You have two guys that have proven it, and then one guy who's never taken a snap in the NFL. If you had to rank these guys in order, what order would you put them in?
I would probably go exactly the order that you just said there, CMC, Eckler, and Bijan. And I just think that people, I think Bijan in particular is probably getting overdrafted among those three. I think people are underestimating the role that Tyler Algier will be playing in this offense. I mean, he proved it last year as being an effective running back for Arthur Smith. And it wouldn't be surprising to me if Bijan ends up with less than 20 touches per game.
Yeah, do you think this Atlanta offense is going to be good enough to kind of make him worth his ADP?
I mean, that's really what it's going to come down to. I mean, just the Falcons would need to be a top 10 offense, assuming that Algier gets about a third of the running back work for Bijan to just get enough touchdowns and yardage to justify being this high. This highly drafted. And I know that the Falcons in the actual NFL draft took him high. They have a lot invested in this guy, but I mean, this offense would need to be in that elite category for him to justify his fantasy draft position just due to the workload, the share that he's likely to be in with Algier. And we haven't even mentioned Cordell Patterson is certainly going to get some touches each game as well.
All right, and let's look at maybe the three best runners in the league. You see Saquon, Chubb, and Henry drafted right after these big three. And I mean, these guys are competing as the true best rushers in the NFL. If you get to pick one of these guys, who would it be and why?
I would say Chubb. I think the Browns offense has a chance to be top 10. I mean, let's just go back to what we were talking about in that Browns preview. Deshaun Watson's 50.5% success rate ranks seventh in the NFL since 2017 when he was drafted. And we also think Kevin Stefanski is an above average play caller. I mean, he got Baker to ninth in EPA per play in 2020, and Jacoby Brissett last year was 11th in EPA per play. And Watson's certainly more talented than those two. So I think we have to assume that this Browns offense is going to be pretty good. They should be in the red zone quite a bit to get Chubb plenty of rushing touchdowns. And also, I don't think we can discount the fact that Kareem Hunt being gone gives Chubb potentially a much larger role in the receiving game. I mean, I think the majority of those 44 targets that Hunt got last year are likely to go to Chubb rather than Jerome Ford.
Yeah, and I think it's to note that Jerome Ford did get banged up. He'll probably be fine, I assume, but it's something to kind of keep your eye on because it's even
Mm-hmm.
even more just straight on
Even more
Chubb there.
work for Chubb. Yep.
Yep. But okay, so if you're going to target your RB2, are you trying to grab a guy like Mixon or Aaron Jones, or are you going to wait and shoot for upside on a guy like Jameer Gibbs or Miles Sanders?
Well, going back to that opportunity versus skill thing, it seems like Joe Mixon could have an incredibly valuable role in a top three offense in the NFL after the departure of Samaje Perine. I mean, I don't know. I don't think the Bengals are going to trust Travion Williams or rookie Chase Brown to pass block. So it looks like Mixon could be out there for all three downs. And we know that Mixon skill wise has been slowing down, but it might not matter considering the role he's likely to get this year.
Yeah, I think the only thing you kind of got to monitor there is his legal situation that's going on. I'm sure it'll be similar to Kamara's, and he'll be fine for this year, but next year might get a little iffy for him. But
Yeah, I mean the
let
Bengals certainly don't think that the suspension is coming. Otherwise, they would have signed someone right now. But yeah,
mhm,
like you said, you definitely have to keep an eye on it, and maybe that's why he's being a little bit underdrafted.
mhm. So let's move on to what I call the sticky spot in the draft. You hit this spot and you got some tough decisions to make. You have running backs on the board like Madison, Akers, James Cook, and Pacheco. Do you like to target or avoid any of these four?
Well, we talked about Madison earlier. I think he is probably being a little bit underdrafted just based off of his role. And I also don't mind Akers, who should be the lead back in a Rams offense that will likely score points as long as Stafford, Cup, and Havenstein are healthy. I mean, the Rams defense is so bad that we could just see them, giving up 30 plus points per game. And even in garbage time, we know that Stafford puts up numbers. I mean, just remember back to his time in Detroit. And if Akers is out there with Stafford in garbage time, just taking all those checkdowns when opposing defenses are just sitting in quarters, we could see Akers, have some games where he's got 5+ receptions with the Rams trailing. So I like his opportunity, even though I don't like his skill, and that's kind of a theme of
Mhm.
this running backs conversation.
Is there any reasonable doubt that if the Rams start out terribly, they look to trade Matt Stafford, and if Stafford leaves, like is is Akers just done for you, or what do you think about
Yeah.
this offense?
I mean, that's the whole thing with drafting these Rams, particularly even, we might talk about this in the wide receivers podcast with Cooper Cup, but there's a chance that this team takes down the stretch because they have their first round pick for the first time since 2016. So if it doesn't start well for these guys, they certainly could, kind of shut everyone down. And that would be an absolute disaster for Akers, Cup, Stafford, all those guys when you're, trying to make your run in the fantasy playoffs.
So let's look at anyone that you're going to try and avoid this year. Do you have anyone that comes to mind when I say that?
Well, we talked about how I don't really like that big three quarterbacks, and I also really don't love the top five running backs this year either. I mean, Eckler is going to have a hard time maintaining his touchdown rate from the last two seasons, and he won't get as many dump off passes as the Chargers are likely to stretch the field more vertically with Kellen Moore calling the plays instead of Joe Lombardi. There's so many mouths to feed in San Francisco that Kyle Shanahan will be just as happy to use Christian McCaffrey out there as a decoy to force opposing defenses into man coverage. And it's so boomer bust for all these 49ers guys. I mean, some some weeks they might give you a 3 touchdown performance. But I mean, there's just a ton of guys out there to feed. And so, when you're drafting that high in the draft and you know that you're probably going to get, a few duds throughout the season, I don't love the idea of that. We talked about Bijan's potential opportunity, not being there with Algier and Patterson also on the roster. I feel like the Giants offense was a little bit of smoke and mirrors last season, and we think that opposing defensive coordinators are going to force Daniel Jones to throw downfield more often, taking away that easy stuff underneath that Dable was able to scheme up last season, which will eat into Saquon Barkley's workload. And I mean, Derrick Henry had 349 carries last year, and now he's going into his age 29 season. So there's certainly some worry there. So we don't love, I mean, if you're in a snake draft, you're going to just have to take one of these guys, if you're just at the top of the draft. But if you're in an auction draft, I don't know that I'd be spending a ton of money on the top quarterbacks or the top running backs this season.
Yeah, hopefully no one from our league is listening to this, but all right. So let's talk about a running back or two that you do not want to leave your draft without. Is there anyone?
Well, it was hilarious because right before we started recording, I had written down Ramondre Stevenson, but then Ezekiel Elliott just got signed like an hour ago. And the reason I liked Ramondre was because of that role we talked about. I mean, I think the Patriots and Giants offense will finish, with about the same amount of points this year. And Ramondre was getting drafted way lower than Saquon, even though they were both feature backs. Now that's not the case because Zeke is in the building. And I certainly think that the Patriots are going to work Zeke in passing downs just because he's an elite pass blocker. So, but now with the Zeke signing, I think it kind of opens things up for Tony Pollard. I mean, there was always a chance that Zeke was going to go back to Dallas. We know Dak was pushing for that internally. And now, I mean, it's likely that Pollard can get 300 touches in a top 10 offense, knowing that Zeke is not going to be there. And I think that Pollard really has RB1 upside. Like, I'm talking about the best running back in the league. We know he's one of the most elusive, talented running backs in the NFL, and people have been waiting his whole career for him to get a shot in this feature role. And I'm not really sure why he's getting drafted as a second rounder now that he finally has a chance. I mean, we saw Pollard finished as the RB7 last year, despite ranking outside the top 25 in touches per game. Now that he's going to get plenty of touches, why is everyone so hesitant on Pollard?
It honestly makes no sense, actually, when you think about it like that.
Yeah,
But
I mean, we've been waiting for this his whole career, and Zeke just signed with the Pats. Like, it's time. It's Tony Pollard time.
yeah, it's Tony Pollard time, and I think people are probably going to realize that after week 1 or 2 when he is just popping off. But
And he might start moving up ADP. I mean, we're using ADP
yeah,
right now on today, and obviously it hasn't adjusted for the Zeke news. But yeah, I mean, I just don't know why Pollard isn't being drafted among those elite guys.
yeah, they got him at running back 7 right now, so we'll see if he starts jumping up a little bit. But if you're going to go for a late round dart throw or a handcuff that's actually worth having, do you have anyone in mind?
I think for a late round dart, I'm going to go with Damian Harris for the Bills. And I don't think it's far fetched to think that Harris could score 10 to 15 touchdowns this season. Just in that high powered Bills offense trying to protect Josh Allen a little bit more. They're going to give Harris probably a lot of looks at the goal line. It could be a situation like Jamal Williams was in last year with the Lions when he was in a clear timeshare overall at running back, but he always got the goal line work. In an offense that had no trouble getting into the red zone. So I'll take that. I mean, Harris has an ADP of 165 right now, and especially in non-PPR leagues, a guy that I think has a pretty decent shot at scoring 10 to 15 touchdowns. That'll be my late round dart, even though we know he's not going to be consistent week to week. I mean, maybe if you're drafting in like best ball type of things, he's even more valuable because he can give you that boom performance, randomly throughout the year, 2 or 3 touchdown games.
Yeah, I like that one. I mean, we've been hearing that the 33-year-old Latavius Murray has just been tearing up camp. So I, I
I
don't
feel
know.
like we hear about Latavius Murray every offseason, and he's still chugging.
It's actually incredible how many years that guy's been in the league. All right, let's move it over to some of the YouTube comments and questions we've been getting. So we've had a lot of questions about your role in the company since you've basically been anonymous all these years.
Yeah, I mean, I addressed it in the first podcast, and then someone asked a question below that, and Bob answered. So I'll just read what Bob said too, just to kind of clear things up. And here's just to quote Bob. He says, "I used to do all the handicapping and write-ups for both college and NFL, but it got to be too much. It really helps that Tanner does that detailed research and writes up the NFL notes. I just do some editing." He's taken the model we worked on together 6 years ago and added to it over the years since. I add the technical analysis portion to the overall model, but the nuts and bolts are Tanner, which I think is a great summary of what's
Mhm.
happening. So it's still a team effort. Bob is still helping with the NFL handicapping process, but it's sort of that's kind of my purview. That's what I'm spending most of my time on in the fall, while Bob, being one of, in my opinion, the best college football bettors of all time, focuses on his bread and butter, college football. And then as far as college basketball goes, it's a team of us with Bob, Jay, and myself putting in the work to keep up with 360 plus college basketball teams on a daily basis. And I'm as we're all doing that work, I'm synthesizing that information and then doing the originating for college basketball. So that's kind of been my role at the company. I've been doing the NFL for 6 years, and I've been doing college basketball for 3 years. And that's where we're going to be at for the 2023 season as well. Just after our solid results last year, we kind of like where we're at in terms of divvying up the work. And so we're going to basically roll out the same approach again this season.
Nice. That's a great breakdown of kind of all of your guys' roles and how that works. But let's talk about some of the QBs we've had brought up in our comment section. So we are getting some criticism about Jared Goff being rated as the 26th best quarterback in your metrics.
Yeah. I mean, I don't really think it's crazy to say that. I might just be Lions fans getting a little bit too hyped up about their guy. I mean, Goff graded as PFF's 20th quarterback last year, and he finished below Marcus Mariota with a completion percentage versus expectation of minus 2.1%. So, I mean, there's a lot of other places that are, deeming Goff as a clearly below average guy as well. And if anything, Detroit fans should just be taking it as a massive compliment that their offensive coordinator, Ben Johnson, is producing, great scoring output despite having a mediocre quarterback.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things to do is separating real life football and fantasy football, as we said earlier. But even though Goff ranked, I think he was 10th or top 10 and as a quarterback last year in fantasy football, that doesn't mean that he was that good in real life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You have to separate, overall production from individual player talent. And obviously you have to layer in how much of the scheme is accounting for all that production as well. And I feel like that's what we do really well here at Dr. Bob Sports when we're handicapping. And so, we had Goff as a clearly below average quarterback. And I would say that he's going to likely be a below average quarterback again this season, while the Lions will still probably have a pretty solid offense as long as Ben Johnson is there.
All right. Well, I think that will do it for our quarterbacks and running backs episode. Leave your comments, questions, all of that below, and we will address them for wide receivers and tight ends when we're back on Friday. So, as always, make sure to like and subscribe if you have not.